Any folks we need to keep in our prayers before we get started this morning that we need to recognize or remember? I probably need to get a bulletin with all the names in there. Anything to add? Okay, guess not. Richard's in Mexico, right? Everything going according to plan down there? Perfect timing, gets to escape the winter storm apparently that we're about to get. I'm not ready for that. All right. Well, if we have no additional prayers, no additional requests. Let's say a prayer and then we'll get started. Dear God, we thank you for today. We thank you for the sunshine that you've blessed us with. We thank you for this congregation. We thank you for the members that make up the body here. We're grateful for the leaders of this congregation. We thank you for those that teach. We pray that you'll be with us this morning during our class and all those that have class this morning, that they will be engaged, participate, and not just open up the Word, but open up our minds and our hearts to identify some opportunities for us to be just a little bit more knowledgeable in the Word than maybe before we came in today. Father, we know that there are many among us, friends and family, that are not well. There are many mentioned in the bulletin: Kara's sister Lori, Gwen, Richard as he's traveling. That we'd like to lift up to you and to ask for your healing hands on those that are sick, and to keep those that are traveling, such as Richard, safe. We thank you for being with many of us, our family included, and Dave and Lisa, that we've all been under the weather recently, and we're grateful that we've improved, that we can be here together this morning. We thank you again for Jesus, for his example, for his love, and his willingness to come to this earth, to live a life that is without blemish, and that we can have the hope in to walk according to the calling and to be in heaven together one day with you. It's in Christ's name that we pray. Amen. All right, look, let me set a couple of ground rules. Number one, Aiden, Maddie, and Sadie all know this because I've taught their class. I am not anywhere close to the most intelligent person in the Word or anything, so therefore I need your help. This is really meant to be... I even don't like standing and sitting up here because I feel like it's like a university lecture. I'm not a huge fan of that because it feels like I'm talking to you, and I do not like that. I don't have the ability or the knowledge or, quite frankly, the stomach to be able to do that. So I'm going to need your help. You're going to get a lot of rawness from me. I'll tell you when I don't know, and there's going to be a lot of those situations. But that's also an opportunity for me, candidly, to dig in and improve. Those that have taught at any age group, it really is incredible how much you do learn and how much you forget, how important it is to just dig in, even for 5, 10, 15 minutes a day in preparation for study. So I was grateful that Keith asked me. I was also extremely hesitant because a lot of wise folks, anytime you're teaching an adult class, it's like, oh, I don't know if I'm able. I don't know if I'm wise enough. I don't know if I have the ability to. But so my ask is help me. I didn't need your help, okay? That's really the only ground rule. That's it. So it could be that we'd be done in 10 minutes and we could have a really, however, if we follow that first ground rule, there's a good chance we could go, I may not even get past the first page potentially. But, when Keith asked me to lead the discussion, I thought to myself, what in the world am I going to talk about? If you've been a Christian, more than, 10 plus years, you've probably heard all of the different lessons potentially, dug through all the studies. And I'm a very, I told you, simple person. I have to read things no matter what it is 3 or 4 times for me to actually to stick in my mind. So why not go right to Romans, one of the most complicated books, one of the most incredibly thought-provoking books, both outside of the religious world and inside. The book of Romans is an incredibly well-renowned piece of literature for multiple reasons. So that's what our study is going to be about. Not only this morning, we'll dig in a little bit, but for the next several weeks. And I don't know if it was perfect timing, but Royce, right before he moved down to Texas, I don't know if you know this, he left a substantial number of books that were part of his personal collection, books and notebooks with studies and all this stuff. And so I went down there, Keith was showing me, and I pulled down this book of Romans, and I started looking at it. I'm like, wow, this is pretty impressive. So that's where this all came from. And I just thought about how I learn the best. And for me, it's not always about jumping right into the book. We'll do that. We might get into the first half of chapter 1 today. But I like to look at a little bit of the context of who wrote the book. I mean, we all know that Paul wrote the book, but I want to dig in and look at Paul for a little bit. Who he was, some background on Paul, where he came from. It kind of helps shape, as we read and as we dig into the book of Romans, it kind of helps understand where he's at in his life and why he's writing this, right? Why he's delivering the message in the book of Romans that he's delivering. So we'll do that this morning for a little bit. We'll look at, again, big picture Romans, the purpose, why it's so well known, and if we have time, we'll dig in probably the first half of chapter 1. So let me ask you this. What do you know about Paul, just the man? What do you know about him? This is the part where I need your help.
Describes himself as a Jew,
He's
the tribe of Benjamin,
yeah.
Pharisee.
Yeah, so he grew up a Jew, right? Like a pretty. I have some verses written down here. So he lived as a strict Pharisee. So some references to that Philippians. We want to turn there. Philippians 3:5. He references this, right? A lot of people. I don't know. I forgot about it. I forgot that Paul was a Jew. And grew up in the strict tribe of Benjamin. His father, and I think his father before him. Philippians 3, verse 5. I'll back up and read verse 4 first. Though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee. Acts 23:6. There's some more references to Paul as a Pharisee, a Jew. 26:5 in the book of Acts as well. So yes, he grew up a Jew, a very strict Jew, under the tribe of Benjamin. Absolutely. What else? What else do we know about Paul or Saul? Not just his life. Where is he from? Tarsus. What do we know about Tarsus? Anything? And again, I did not know this until I studied this about 2 weeks ago. You know anything about Tarsus?
Was it a port city?
Yeah, so it was, I don't know how I would equate it to a city today. But yeah, it was a center of commerce, trade, learning. A lot of universities and if I can say secondary education, advanced education was centered in Tarsus. It was a really important and major trade route that linked Europe with the Middle East during that time. The trade route specifically, actually, so just north of the city, there was the mountain range of Tarsus, and that's where that trade route really was. But it was a bustling downtown, right? Streets full of merchants, traders, right? It was a busy, very populous, depending on how you define educated, highly educated place, right? A lot of folks that were knowledgeable in secular study and to some degree Jewish study. So Tarsus was also a self-governing city. They weren't under any kind of rule at that point. I didn't dig into this a ton, but they had some period of civil war, and the commentary I was looking at said specifically that they had some kind of good fortune. I don't know if they got some sort of aid during that civil war, or they just, some things fell in their favor during that period of civil war, but they were self-governing, they were standalone as a result of some good fortune during some periods of the Civil War. So Paul was from a pretty important geographical city. It wasn't this podunk town that had nobody, or it was him and his family type of thing. Tarsus was a major, I can say, metropolitan area back in those days. We already said that he was of the tribe of Benjamin. What else do we know? Who did he study with? Anybody remember who he studied with? We know. Starts with a G. What was it? Gamaliel. So Acts 22 references that. Do you remember anything about Gamaliel that Paul may have referenced? Or even probably Luke, as he's called out in the book of Acts. I didn't remember this, but it seemed that because Gamaliel, very well known, very well respected in the religious community. I don't know if I would describe his attitude on certain things as laissez-faire. Is that how you say it? A little bit more lenient to some degree from what I have determined. Where Paul, it seems, or Saul at this point, is it safe to say that he leaned more towards the stricter, more drastic measures of operations? I mean, let's think about some of the things that Saul did prior to converting, right? Would you say some of those things that Saul did were rather drastic in his measures? So let's think about what were some of those things? What was he known for? What did he do?
Church.
How did he persecute the church?
Had people arrested, stoned.
Killed, thrown in jail, right? Yeah. I think even today, by our standards, we would say that that's pretty drastic measures, just for having that belief, right?
He describes himself as zealous. He describes himself as being a zealous person.
Yeah.
What more would you expect from him? Whether doing the right or the wrong, he was zealous in.
And I think it's fair to say that he felt he was doing the right thing, right? I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. While, Saul lived, in theory, two separate lives to a degree in terms of the message he was delivering, and he was on fire both times. Right? What's that say about us? Right? What's that say about us and how often I, and maybe you are, just lukewarm in what we do? Right? It's hard. I should say it's easy to be lukewarm. It really is, especially in today's world. But to be as zealous as Paul or even Saul was in his conviction and what he was doing and why he was doing it, he was very much passionate. I think when I think physically about Paul, I try to picture who this guy was. So his namesake, if I can call him that, in the Old Testament, King Saul. Do you know anything physically about King Saul? What do you know? Molly's shaking her head, yeah.
And above everybody else.
He was, I can say it like this, he was the man, right? Like, the goat. Molly said it, I didn't say it, right? He was, I don't know, well over 6 foot, as many of us men probably strive to be. Aiden's already there. I'm super jealous of that. Like, my whole life I've been trying to get to 6 foot, and I'm just shy. I'm still 5'11". Saul's probably he's probably 6'3" at 18 years old. Chiseled, probably, the whole tall, dark, and handsome, well-spoken. That's what Paul in the Old Testament, King Saul, was like physically. We don't know much about Paul or Saul in the New Testament physically, but as you think about who he might be or what he might look like, it's just interesting to maybe put a picture in your head. What do you think of when you think of Paul, the man that we know that wrote the book of Romans and wrote all these letters to the church, the missionary? How do you think that he looks physically?
which we never know what that is. Was it a physical that I could have seen it, or was it just something that was bothersome to him? And I bet that bothered him because I do feel like he was very self-assured. That's how I picture him, is just very looking. Sometimes you can tell a person's self-assured just by the way they carry themselves. And I feel like that's how I always picture him, being very confident.
Yeah, or maybe insecure, right? Maybe it was the opposite.
Right.
I have no idea how accurate this is, but when I picture Paul, he comes from a place like Tarsus, where we've already identified that a lot of education, right, a lot of learning takes place there. And this is a guy that we know was on fire for what he believed in prior to the conversion, and even after his conversion, continued to be on fire. And the way, he wrote, a lot of folks back then wrote, but he was a missionary, he wrote letters, right? I just picture Paul of the New Testament as this guy, this skinny, maybe bald-headed gentleman with I don't know, maybe a unibrow, like long nose, maybe some kind of, I didn't think they had glasses back then. I just picture him like as this guy, like you look at him and you're like, man, that guy knows a lot. You could just tell he knows a lot, right? He's just incredibly, incredibly intelligent and very well spoken, well written, and doing a little bit of homework on who Paul might be physically. It seems that it seems to be a little bit of a theme, and there's a little bit of an agreement that is what he seemed to look like. So perhaps it was maybe insecurity was his. Who knows? I don't know. That has no bearing on the book of Romans at all. I'm just more interested in learning about who this guy is that wrote this book, right? Where does he come from? Why does he think the way he thinks, right? And one of the things that I always find interesting is, what did he look like? Like, how can I picture this person? A lot of times we picture Jesus, and we see pictures as you grow up in Bible class of what Jesus looked like, right, with his beard, right? A very well-manicured beard at that, mind you. Very well-manicured for someone probably who didn't have a razor or Barbasol, right? But Paul, this very studious-looking guy. I don't know, just an interesting perspective on how you look at the author, Paul. Many thought he was part of the Sanhedrin Council at some point in his life. I don't know. I have no idea. We know that he communicated with the council several times, right? Was in front of them. There's arguments that he might have been at one point in his career, maybe pre-conversion, part of that, because of his education, because of his upbringing as a Jew, and a strict Jew at that, right? And Mahler mentioned that he was zealous, and he describes himself as zealous, even prior to the conversion, on fire, right? Very passionate, convicted in the work that he was doing. But then all that changed. Well, sort of. All of it changed on the road to Damascus. I'm going to ask it's going to be potentially, you're going to think it's a rhetorical question, but I promise you it's not. What happens on the road to Damascus? Come on, what happens?
Meets Jesus.
Yeah. His life changes from that point on. Who he is as a person doesn't change a whole lot. He's still very convicted in the work that he's doing, right? He's still incredibly intelligent, well-written, well thought of, right? Well-educated. All the things that he probably struggled with prior to physically, the thorn in the side, probably still he struggle with, right? But he sees Jesus. Now, many theologians, many folks that try to discredit this conversion, they try to explain it in psychological terms, in physical terms. So let's for sake of conversation do that for a minute. How could we potentially begin to explain Saul's conversion? What could be an argument? I'll give you one. Many people think that this conversion was created because of Paul's fatigue and strain from travel. So they thought he was maybe going crazy and that he was seeing things. You ever heard somebody tell you that before? You ever maybe thought to yourself, I'm so tired, like I'm delusional? There are a lot of folks that want to discount the word and the work that Paul does. Will try to tell you that it wasn't really Jesus. Wasn't God. It was because he was seeing things. He was hearing things. I don't know if you thought of that. What else? So if you think about it from that perspective, what possibly else could be an argument for that conversion in the physical sense? What had just happened prior to that? Acts 8, the end of Acts 8, I think it was. Somebody died. Maybe it's Acts 7. I don't remember.
Stephen?
Yeah. Who was there? Who was, I don't know if leading the charge is the right way to say it, but was he in favor of Stephen's stoning? He was. He was, right? And shortly thereafter, this conversion takes place. Many folks argue that he felt remorse over that. And that's why he saw the light. Again, by no means am I saying that what we read in the Bible is, what I'm trying to do is provide some perspective on what non-Christians, people that want to argue against the word, will say. And we need to be prepared for that, right? Many will say, because he was traveling quite a bit still. Many will say he struggled, he suffered from epilepsy. Many say that because he was traveling so much, he had sunstrokes or some kind of physical issue from being in the sun so often, or being struck by lightning. That's some of the arguments that are out there to explain this conversion, other than what we know to be true. I see Craig like there's no way that's possible. This is ridiculous, right? But you got to think, like, Paul being as convicted as he was and what he was doing prior to being converted, a lot of these things that we hear, these people are convicted in why this potentially could be the case. Maybe they're out to prove that this isn't real. Maybe that's there. Who knows? I think it's important that we know some of those things that are out there that try to disprove or discredit the things that we, again, know to be true, like Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. Right? However, what none of those arguments account for is Paul's, if I can put it so plainly, his theology. They can't explain the gospel that Paul declares. What he does, what he says, and how he does it, essentially immediately after that conversion. Nobody can explain that. The 180, I mean, let's be real, it's a complete 180, is it not? I mean, the attitude and how he goes about doing it is not different, but the message. Think about what we just talked about. Craig, you said he persecuted the church, right, prior to in his Saul days. What were some of the things he was doing? Persecuting the church, like specifically, what was he doing?
In jail.
He had people thrown in jail. He had people beaten and stoned, right? All kinds of stuff. It's very, I don't know if ironic is the right grammatical term, but a lot of the things that Paul was doing and forcing on other people, he immediately became the recipient of that on the other end. Right? So as he began to proclaim the gospel with the same zeal that he had prior, he was met with the same, mainly Jewish opposition that he had been a part of. So think about that. The people that he was kind of standing side by side with, arguing with, messaging for, he was now going head to head. You ever been a part of something like that? Where, whether it's an individual or a group, that you're a part of that group, maybe, I don't know if it's a group of friends in school or a resource group at your work, I don't know, that you're part of, and then for some reason or another, you stop being a part of it. I don't know. I'll tell you, like in high school and certainly college, there's a lot of folks that I spent time with that I still call friends to this day. That very much oppose or don't believe in the idea of a God, right? So that's not to say that I can't still communicate and be friends with those people, right? But it's just different, right? Once you come to that realization that I know what I need to communicate, I know how I need to represent myself, right, around somebody like that. Can't take part and laugh in this, perhaps, and have conversations in the same things that they might, because that's not what God would expect of me, right? That's a very specific example, but that's what Paul was dealing with. Probably people that he called friends, and maybe continue to call friends. He was going head to head with, right? This all led to the same kind of physical blows that Paul was delivering pre-Paul in his Saul days that he received as Paul, right? So in 2 Corinthians, there's a very well-known, I think it's 2 Corinthians 11, where he talks through all the different things that he suffered, right? Being shipwrecked, being imprisoned, being beaten, thrown in jail. In the book of Philippians, we just read, like, he's in jail writing that letter, right? Like, you talk about zealous and who this person is writing these letters. It's really, really, I don't know if another impressive. It's really inspiring. If I ever got thrown in jail, you can rest assured I'm not writing a letter. I hate writing letters if I'm not doing anything. I hardly like reading, let alone writing a letter. And this is the kind of person that Paul is. This is the kind of love and compassion that he has, and that we read and that we feel in all of his letters that he's writing to these congregations. Zealous is definitely a way to describe Paul, but it's really hard to pin him down in one word. But he oozes passion, he oozes conviction, right? He oozes boldness. And we'll get into it in a second, but Romans 1:16 is considered the theme of the book of Romans, right? If anybody has that open or knows that verse, what's it say if you paraphrase it? I am not what? I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. Paul is not ashamed. He's never been ashamed. And that is a lesson we can learn from Paul. And Romans is a culmination of a lot of these experiences that Paul has gone through. A lot of the thoughts that he's had and the realizations that he's come to in his life. And he has been through a lot. He has been through a lot. All right, let me catch up to where I'm at. So let's think about, so we talked about Paul. Let's think about where he is right now, just geographically speaking, as he's writing. Right? We just talked about Philippians. He's literally in jail writing a letter to the church of Philippi. So what is Paul? He is a missionary, right? So where has he been just prior up to this point? Paul had been in Antioch, in Syria. He had gone to Galatia, and then he had gone across is it Aegean? Is that how you pronounce it? Aegean Sea? Let's just say it's the Aegean Sea. Into Macedonia. And I don't know how to pronounce this place. I think it's called Achaia. Achaia is what I read. And it's that region that he established, or the church at Corinth was established. So when you read letters to the Corinthians, or you talk about the church at Corinth, it's in that area, that Macedonia and Achaia, I don't know how to pronounce it, area. That's where the church at Corinth is. And we see that in Acts 16 and Acts 18. Then he goes to Ephesus, which is in Asia. Then he goes back to the church at Corinth in Macedonia to revisit some of these young churches. That's an important part of a missionary's work, establishing a church and then think about parents, right? Children, you have to constantly revisit them and make sure that they're okay, or they're doing the things that they need to do to finish the job or to be successful. It's same thing with Paul, right? In these young churches, right? They're so young, they're in their infant, right? They're probably just getting milk, right? If I can say it like that in Paul's terms, where he wants to constantly come back and check on them to make sure they're getting the right kind of nutrients, right kind of messaging, right kind of spiritual goodness, right? So he goes back to these churches, and it is then where he writes Romans. Now, has he been to the church at Rome yet? Has he visited these Christians at Rome? Do we know? He has always tried to but he has not actually ever made it to Rome at this point. So he might have come across some of the members, perhaps in his travels, but he has not yet been to that church. He has not yet visited that congregation in Rome. Do you find that interesting? And why do you find it interesting? Whether interesting in a positive sense or negative sense.
Me right into a church in Texas, telling them all this stuff, and I don't even know these people.
Well, yes, but so I wrote it down somewhere. Hold on, let me see if I can find it. I don't know where it's at. In one of Paul's letters, he specifically calls out his ambition is to proclaim the gospel like any other missionary, where it has yet to be proclaimed. Now you got to think. Paul's from Tarsus, a relatively major metropolitan area. Again, it's going to sound like a rhetorical question, but it is not. What is Rome? The empire, right? Like the epicenter. Do you think the word of God has been proclaimed in Rome? I mean, clearly it has, right? The church is established there, right? But you would think, and this is what I find interesting, you would think that the epicenter, right, with probably such a loud, in a good way, voice and stage and microphone, if I can say it like that, influence to the surrounding regions, would have been a great place for him to visit by this point. You would think. Now, clearly Paul had his reasons, right? But he hadn't been there yet. Maybe perhaps he didn't need to. He didn't feel like he needed to. But he's always wanted to go. And he's aiming to go back. I mean, he's telling them in the first chapter that I have longed to see you. I want to be with you. But he has not made it back yet. Or he's not made it there yet, I should say. It's arguable and debated that this book is probably written around somewhere between 50 and 60 AD. Just to give you some context on time. So that's who wrote this book. That's who wrote this letter. That's where he's from. That's where he was at. He had been through a lot up to that point. He had been through a lot in his life. And again, one of the reasons why Romans is known as a profound book, just in a literature sense, is because of how he writes it. I don't know if anybody here is a literature or English guru. I am not. But it's not a systematic or methodical structure to his writing. And many argue that's why it's so profound. Because it is, as you read it, it's very much, how did I write it here? His writings are confessions of what God had done with his life and of the struggle into which this declaration of the gospel had drawn him. That's what makes Romans so powerful. And you can kind of feel a little bit of that in all Paul's writings, in my opinion. But I think Romans is one of those books where it's just, I mean, you think about some of the well-known verses and statements in this book, right? He's almost proclaiming, shouting, right? Like, how can, what shall we say then? Should we continue in sin so that grace may abound? And he's certainly not, right? You can just see him and feel him screaming this, if I can say it like that. Like probably putting a hole in the paper he's writing because he's so passionate and he's so zealous about it, right? That's who's writing this book. He's at a point in his life where he is not ashamed. He does not care. Again, I'm saying this in a positive sense, what others think, because he knows what is most important. And he has found that out through a lot of struggle, through a lot of wrongdoings, through a lot of time in jail, probably a lot of self-reflection, right? Through a lot of travel, through a lot of hardships, physically, emotionally, lifting others up. He has come to this realization that the gospel is not just what God has done and all these cool historical things that he knows very well growing up as a Jew, but that it lives and breathes, and it is the power of salvation to everyone. To everyone. And that's a really important component of Romans, right? Is Paul grew up a Jew, right? They're the special people. They're the chosen people, right? If you're outside the Jew, you're a Gentile, which typically means what back then? What's that mean? Good luck. Sorry. Again, Paul, in this realization, he calls it out many times for the Jew first and also for the Greek. The gospel is for all, right? And he is shouting that aloud, and that rubs people the wrong way. And he knows it, because he was preaching that message not long ago, right? He was preaching that message. It's also interesting as we dig into the study, and job well done. It is. We got 5 minutes. I am super excited that we got to talk about Paul a lot, because I think I don't know about you, it just helps me personally set up what we're about to dig into. We could very easily go verse by verse and chapter by chapter, and that is very helpful, and we'll do a lot of that. But I always like to pause and just look at who in the world is this person writing this, and where is he at in his life? What's going through his mind? That helps us understand a little bit about the writings that we're going to read just through the coming weeks. Why does he say it like that? You know, he didn't memorize the message, right? He didn't repeat the same thing over and over necessarily. He clarifies it over and over, and he applies it to life situations, which to me is so helpful for me personally. Paul may have lived, 2,000 years ago, approximately. But the same things he battled, same things he struggles with, aren't far off from what we struggle with. You may not, at least in the United States perhaps, not get thrown in jail. There are areas of the world you're going to get thrown in jail for preaching the Word of God. So in that sense, it's not a whole lot different. Really quick. What's the purpose? We talked about why Romans is important, but for the next just maybe 3 or 4 minutes, he's writing to a group, right? His audience is very specific. His audience is the church at Rome whom he's never visited. What's the purpose of the book? What's the purpose of the letter? Why does he write it to the church? Do we know? What's usually the reason for writing a letter to any person or audience? What's one of the first things you're going to try to do in that letter? Yeah, he wants to tell them something specific, right? But usually there's also some encouragement that goes along with that, right? Almost always when you write a letter or when you get a letter, there's some level of encouragement in that letter, right? Now that may turn sharply if there's a really difficult message to communicate after that, and Paul does a great job of that throughout many of his letters. But a really common theme throughout the entire letter is the encouragement that he has and the encouragement that he provides them in their newfound faith. We see it a couple times in chapter 15 and later in chapter 1 that he reminds them of the significance of the importance that they're committed to. Like remembering the big picture, right? Why we're doing this, right? What are we striving for? You know, why do you call yourselves Christian? Let's remember that. Let's remember that. He calls it out in, I think it's later I think it's like 15 or 16, that he says he wants to go to Spain and proclaim the word there. So there's a thought, and he kind of makes a indirect ask of the church at Rome, even though he's never been there, but he knows the heart's there. Kind of like how the church of Philippi, he thanked them for their support, both maybe physically as he's there traveling, but also monetarily. There is a thought that he is going to ask them as he travels there for monetary support as he begins to work to go to Spain. So that could be another reason why he's writing this letter, to preface, hey, I'm going to need your help as we continue to spread the good news in the gospel to the other regions that maybe haven't had a chance to hear it yet. And again, and as we end, I'd encourage us all, read chapter 1. It's your typical, I say typical, it's got your common themes, right, of a letter. First part, introductory, right? It pronounces the theme very early on in chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. There's the theme. And we're going to spend the lion's share of next week talking about those verses specifically. But there's a couple things I'd love to hit on prior to that in the first 15 verses that we'll look at together. But read chapter 1. And if you really want to be extra credit, read chapter 2, just so you can have a head start on next week. We probably won't get to chapter 2, but dig into chapter 1 and just write some things down. Write some things down that maybe you identify, you have questions on, or you thought about as to, I never thought about him saying that, or I never thought about him writing that. Now that we know a little bit more about who is writing this book, right? With that, wow, that went really fast, I have to say. I was a little nervous, but thanks for the discussion. Thanks for your participation. Again, dig into chapter 1. We'll look into it next week, and we'll get into the book of Romans. Thanks.